On May 2nd, the National Endowment for the Arts pulled proposed grants from hundreds of arts organizations across the country. Several of those arts organizations put out statements expressing their disappointment in the federal government, as well as assuring their patrons that they can continue arts programs, at least for the short term. So Donald Trump's administration has made a very, very strong effort to dismantle arts and culture or to overtake arts and culture entirely. That is the goal of the administration. They want to defund the NEA by fiscal year 2026 completely. They just want to get rid of it and dismantle it. And this has been on the agenda for a lot of conservatives for a very long time, at least since Reagan. I think it's time for us to just kind of take a look at kind of a brief history of the NEA, the budget, what are the goals of conservatives and why conservatives hate the NEA so much, and whether or not, even answering the question whether arts should be funded by the federal government or not. I think that is a question, especially depending on the type of person or your politics. That's a good question to have, whether or not the federal government should have the responsibility to fund arts and culture within the United States or within any type of nation. The National Endowment for the Arts was created in 1965 by Lyndon B. Johnson's administration as part of his Great Society agenda. The 1960s was a pivotal decade in the United States history, as anybody who has opened a history book or has even seen Forrest Gump knows. So you definitely had a lot of cultural upheaval that was happening during the 1960s. You had a lot of, not just with the civil rights movement, but you also had people who were fighting against the Vietnam War. You had second wave feminism. You had even the idea that the first part of the idea that sexual identity and sexual orientation were two separate ideas and they were not some sort of disease or some sort of mental illness. That was the idea that was the prominent idea of what homosexuality was and, LGBTQ, all of that. Like you were having the first part of these are cultural identities that make the United States the nation that it is. Everybody here and, in the United States, we are a giant melting pot. These were the first ideas in the 1960s that have come about that kind of fostered and grew and is largely now taken over by neoliberalism. Let's just be clear with that. But you also have people who were on the conservative side of things fighting hard against LBJ's Great Society agenda. Why would arts and culture be part of this Great Society? Well, the reasoning being was that LBJ wanted to have wanted to have a more educated populace, wanted to better the individual lives of the American citizens because it's considered great drivers of the economy. So it's not necessarily like a socialism reason that there's not a leftist reason on why LBJ wanted to have a great society. It all is to still feed the nation state and to better the United States in general. However, the idea that the United States should be funding arts and culture comes about with the idea of kind of categorize and kind of define what makes American culture and American art, American culture, American art. The NEA is an independent agency, and while it is governed by a chairman and a council, it largely exists to allot funding to arts organizations across the country. And it does fund all 50 states. It is the only financial support of its kind that is on the federal level that gives money directly to arts organizations and arts education and arts culture. We don't really have the concept of a national art scene in the United States. That's just, we don't have national art. We have what appears to be national art, And we definitely have some art that people have categorized as American art, such as jazz. So there are some art that people look at and say that is American art. However, it's more of a loose category of what art is in the United States. You have American artists like Georgia O'Keeffe. Is that considered American art? Is Jackson Pollock considered American art? Is Jasper Johns considered American art? I think you understand and you get that we don't really have that concept in the United States. And the closest we can get to that is the National Endowment for the Arts funding arts programs directly. Now that we're 60 years into the future, did the Great Society fulfill its promise? Well, no, it did not, unfortunately. And the only reason it really didn't is because there was a very strong backlash to it at the beginning. Conservatives have had the NEA in their crosshairs since the beginning, since 1965. But it really came to a head in the 80s and 90s, especially under the Reagan administration. Reagan's administration defunded a lot of the NEA based primarily on the old inception of the NEA, which gave money straight to certain artists in order to create larger works. Conservatives do not like the idea of taxpayer money going towards individual artists, especially individual artists that they consider, quote, un-American or left-leaning or do not promote, quote, American values, according to conservatives. In 1990, under political pressure from conservatives, the NEA pulled funding from 4 artists known as the NEA 4. Those 4 artists are Kieran Finley, Holly Hughes, John Fleck, and Tim Miller. The artists in question were creating work that was speaking towards human sexuality, human sexual orientation, and cultural and sexual identity. Now, the NEA 4 did sue in a case known as Finley versus the National Endowment for the Arts in 1992, as citing that this was a violation of their First Amendment rights. And they are right. It is a violation of their First Amendment rights. However, we have to consider why conservatives would attack these particular artists. Again, they were creating work that spoke towards sexuality and sexual orientation and how that might be challenging to a conservative lawmaker. This is the reasoning that conservatives have to defund the NEA and anything that the NEA does. They do not want taxpayer funding going towards artists that they deem outside of the conservative agenda. It is a form of anti-intellectualism, of course. However, conservatives don't really care about that. Conservatives want to be able to define art. And it's better for a lot of conservatives to say they just want to scrap the entire funding entirely. They don't want this money going towards, quote, promoting the homosexual agenda. Finley versus the National Endowment for the Arts ended up going to SCOTUS, going to the Supreme Court, and the decision was upheld that this was a violation of the artist's rights. However, in 1998, that ruling was reversed in a way to say that the NEA does have the right to revoke funding or consider decency standards when rewarding grant money. The NEA and the federal government can say that they don't think that this particular idea that this artist has is worthy of funding or not. And that right now is how the NEA operates today. Due to the SCOTUS decision reversal in 1998, in practice, the NEA doesn't quite fund individual artists as much anymore. They rather fund arts organizations that have proper 503 status, as well as rewarding funding towards programs that promote art education and children's arts education programs. So you're going to see more of a national art scene tied more towards children arts education and children's programming. So a lot of Americans nowadays only see arts in the way that it would be beneficial to children, and that would promote children just doing something very fun in the afternoon versus forming a cultural identity, which was the idea that the NEA should promote in the first place. So how much of the national budget actually goes towards the National Endowment for the Arts? Not as much as you think. In fiscal year 2024, I believe the national budget was $6.75 trillion. NEA's budget was $207 million. That's $207 million spread over all 50 states and all of the territories to fund arts programs such as Shakespeare in the Park and just your local arts council. That it doesn't seem like a lot of money. However, part of the deal in accepting NEA funds is that you need to match those funds in order to accept the funds. So you would have local arts organizations, let's say, for instance, they got a $25,000 grant from the NEA. They will need to match that with private donors, $25,000, in order to actually accept the grant. So a lot of NEA funding now goes towards arts organizations that are already established, that already have large donor bases, that rely heavily not just on the NEA grant itself, but on private donors giving money to those arts organizations to stay alive. So the U.S. government budget is $6.75 trillion. In comparison, here are some other administration and agencies, what their budget looks like. The Social Security Administration budget is $1.5 trillion. The Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP, aka food stamps, is $113 billion. The military is $820.3 billion, with 776 of that going towards the Department of Defense directly. The National Park Service is $3.1 billion. And the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, the weather people, is $6.35 billion. So defunding NEA would not be a very hard task for the Trump administration to do. They can easily do it, considering that only $207 million of $6.75 trillion of the U.S. budget goes directly to the NEA. It's a drop in the hat and doesn't really amount to things with the overall budget. However, those NEA funds mean the world to those smaller organizations, your local organization that does need that money in order to function and have arts and culture in its local community. So if you want to save your local art program, what do you need to do? Well, most of the local arts organizations are going to tell you to do the things that you always are supposed to do. You're supposed to write or call your congressperson. You're supposed to advocate for arts programs within your community. You're supposed to give money, if you can, to various arts organizations so they can stay alive. All of that is well and good, but we also have to consider the fact that this is a larger culture war. We cannot work within the system anymore in order to keep our arts programs alive. We need to answer the question whether or not art is worth it for us to continue forward with the progression that the country is going. This country is fast tracking. Now, I have always maintained that the United States is inherently fascist, but we are seeing more of that reality come to fruition more and more for every American. And it's hard to argue sometimes that we need to preserve our arts and culture in the face of people starving and losing their health care. But all of this is part of a larger dismantling of the Great Society. It all stems back to how conservatives felt that, quote, cultural Marxism and socialism took over American society in the 1960s. We don't necessarily want to think that that's where it started, but that's where it started. It started with people, let's just be honest, it started with Black people not wanting to comply with Jim Crow laws anymore. A lot of conservatives consider the 60s as such a turning point in American history and American society that we need to correct ourselves and we need to get back to the way America used to be. And the dismantling of the National Endowment for the Arts and the National Endowment for the Humanities and any other arts programs are part of that going back to the way things are. Now, granted, a lot of their ideas, their cultural ideas that they have about this mythic past in relation to American society was dreamt up by artists. It was dreamt up by artists and American artists drawing on this satire of American iconic culture. It was never really there. You have a lot of artists such as photographer Margaret Bourke White, who faced that American ideals head on in their work. As as a documentary photographer, she showcased how America was falling short of this American dream that we all had, and how that was juxtaposed against the reality of what most Americans dealt with. That was already in American art. When it comes to conservatives and the way that they view art in a very narrow lens where you can't challenge the ideas of the culture that is in the United States. You cannot challenge the nuclear family or the family structure. It's always about the family structure and the family unit. And this idea that you have this hierarchy, it should never be challenged. There's always the status quo that you have to adhere to. And artists by nature buck that status quo. They don't necessarily hate art. They hate most versions of art in its form, and they absolutely hate modern art. A lot of conservatives call it cultural Marxism. They consider art and arts programs to be part of a larger culture war that they must win. And the easiest way to win that culture war is to pull funding from artists and not give them that power. So what do we need to do in the face of that? Yes, you can still try to contact your congressperson. You can still try to work within the system. But quite frankly, the biggest thing you can do is do everything in your power to create any and all work that you can outside of the system. You need to be outside. We need to create more art, and we need to create more artists, and we need to look within mutual aid to solve the problem that the National Endowment for the Arts fails to solve for most artists out there. It's wonderful that this funding exists or existed to fund local arts programs, but we need to take it among ourselves and have more ownership of those local arts programs. That's the way that it needs to be done. We need to have more grassroots ways of dealing with art. Some of that might have to deal with making certain art programs free to the public. Now, of course, funding is one of those things you just need funding. But we can't sit down and lay over. We can't lay over and say, because this funding has now dried up for us, we just need to just lie down and take it. No, we need to be out there more than ever, creating the artwork that the world needs to see.